Okay, so my presentation is about dot quoting, which it is a component of Sellar's metalinguistic theory of meaning, as Iad was mentioning. And so what I'm going to do is sketch in the basics of how Sellar's uses dot quoting in that theory, that metalinguistic theory of meaning, and in his theory about theory change, or how a theory supplants another theory as being in some way superior to it. And I'll try and use that exercise to ask a couple of questions about the relation between Sellar's theory of theory change and Hegel on the one hand and Marx on the other hand. So the way I'll try and broach these questions is going to be somewhat brutally simplistic, especially in comparison with Iad's presentation, but I hope the fact that I'm coming at some of these questions from a different angle might complement his presentation. Okay, so first of all, I want to just give this sketch of the basics of what dot quoting involves. So that is what a dot quote looks like. This is actually a double dot quote. It's a dot quoted dot quote. So what we want to do is work out why you would put dots around terms in this way. So a dot quote, what it does for Sellar's is it forms the dot quoted term into a name for the functional role played by that term when it's used unquoted. So, for example, nyets in the East are nots. So, not in English negates something. It's not raining, perhaps. Nyet in Russian, what we're saying here plays the same role. And yeah, this is a kind of, I think, a nice Cold War example. It's 1967. I guess it's good to choose a language from the other side of the Iron Curtain. In passing, to try and get more specific with regards to theory change, when we dot quote triangular here, and we talk about the triangular, we're talking about a functional role then, which encompasses not only Euclid's conceptualization of triangularity and what Euclid's conception of triangularity is about, what it's dealing with, but also what Riemann's conceptualization of triangularity is about and what Riemann's conceptualization of triangularity is dealing with. Okay, so we can start to see from that that the role played here by this dot quote is that it encompasses what changes, but also what stays the same in the content of theories regarding what triangularity is. So, because between Euclid and Riemann, you actually have a kind of different definitions of what the triangle is, which I'm not really qualified to specify what they are. I mean, Euclid, it's going to be about lines which are defined as having zero thickness. They're going to be on a flat plane. Riemann, I don't know so much about, but I know maybe if you go to Poincaré, you're going to be talking about vectors. Maybe I'm getting the mathematics wrong, but a vector is actually it's a kind of a sort of arrow with a direction. I believe mathematically you can define a triangle in that way, and there's a difference here between Euclid and Poincaré. But the dot quote is saying here that you've got this difference, which is a kind of deepening or an enrichment of the intention or the sense the meaning of what a triangle is, on the one hand, but besides that change, importantly, you have something that's staying the same, which is that we are talking about triangularity still. So the referential or extensional dimension of the functional role, the triangular, stays the same because every triangle which Euclid's theory of triangularity is about is also a triangle which Riemann's and Poincaré's theories of triangularity are about too. Okay, so I guess you might, however, say that this is a bit trivial because in mathematics, mathematical objects they're defined by axioms that the mathematician sets. In any case, and in fact, the mathematician's job is nothing other than proving identities holding between entities, the construction of which flows from differing axiomatic presuppositions. And so maybe talking about mathematics is kind of banal or trivial, and you might have a point. So let's look at an example regarding chairs and electrons. So regarding the difference between like an everyday, quotidian understanding of a chair, and then an understanding of what the chair's made of in physics, which would be stuff like electrons, protons, quarks, and so on. And I'm going to read this from Sellars, from the book Science and Metaphysics. Sellars says, now the physical object of the framework of everyday common sense cannot, in any literal sense, be said to have microphysical objects as their parts. Chairs do not have electrons as parts in the sense in which they have legs as parts. Okay. Whoops.
Yeah, this is it.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
No.
No, sorry.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so what's happening here is a bit different from in mathematics because the referential scope or range of instances here has not stayed the same at all. What's happened here is the semantic content regarding the definition of what the chair is has changed so dramatically, there's in fact no longer a one-to-one overlap between the referential scope of the old term and that of the new term. The chair is in fact not retained amongst the electrons, the protons, and the quarks, etc. So the chair has disappeared, in fact. And it's the same problem as Eddington's two tables, which is, kind of the way I sort of, by default, conceptualize this table on a quotidian level is that I can press my piece of paper on it and write on it because the table sort of stolidly excludes my piece of paper from sinking into it in a soft fashion. But that's in physics, the view is completely different. It's because there's electrons with big spaces in between them, and they're vibrating and bumping into electrons in the piece of paper. So in Eddington's example, you have a radically different conception of what it is to press a piece of paper onto a table. And so what I'm emphasizing is that actually what Sellars thinks is that the table or the chair actually kind of disappears when you, or at least he seems to think that, he seems to be saying that. When you conceptualize it via physics. Okay, and so yeah, chairs are really microphysical particles, electrons, etc. That's a dot quote thing I've written there. And I think that here lies the importance, my hunch at least, is that dot quoting dot quotes comes into play here, because when you dot quote a dot quote, what you're doing I'm thinking, is that you're putting into question the functional role of a functional role. So in other words, you're questioning whether the entire context of presuppositions and so on, in which the functional role used to be used, that entire context was maybe wrong. And so what you're doing is you're disidentifying the chair from what you thought it was, and you're reclassifying it as something else. And that's an argument that, so Brandom has criticized that. Dionysius Christias has responded in a really interesting paper, but I think I probably don't have time to say much more about that. So I should move on, I think. And what I wanted to do in this next step is I want to look at how dot quoting is related to another kind of weapon in Sellers's set of instruments that he uses in his metalinguistic theory of meaning, namely Jomblies. And Jomblies is a kind of thought experiment language. And so let's read this quote, which is again from Sellers from Science and Metaphysics. Sellers says, "One might say what we are saying by concatenating a wise with a Socrates, by writing the referring expression Socrates in boldface or in italics." Okay, so you have a sentence, Socrates is wise. And what you want to do in this thought experiment is not write the sentence this way, because, and you have wise as a separate predicate. This is kind of worrying for Sellers because it looks like you might be treating wisdom as a timeless, eternal, pre-existing form. So it's simply the classical problem of universals, I think, is the key to what's going on, or it's at the center of what's happening here. So the problem of universals, the Empire State Building is tall, but it's not the only thing that's tall in the universe. You also got famous basketball players who are tall. So therefore, tallness is separate from any particular thing. That's why it has generality or is a universal. Horseness, there are many horses, but they all share the characteristic of being a horse. So you have a problem about how to treat the generality or universality of horseness. Okay, so if we write Socrates, if we agree that writing the word in bold will encode characterizing it with an adjective regarding wisdom, then we just write it in bold, and now this inscription is saying that Socrates is wise. If we want to say Socrates is stubbornly persistent, then we can have stubborn persistency encoded in writing his name in italics. And if you want to do both, you write it in bold and in italics. Okay, so I've raised this problem about universals, and now I want to see how Sellers responds. And okay, so what Sellers absolutely needs to avoid saying that a universal is a pre-existing thing or a pre-existing object, and I'm talking about pre-existing with respect to human practice. So a universal is not just a given thing, it's something that gets constructed through our practices. We create the universals. But I don't think he wants to get rid of universals, on the other hand, which he's in a bit of a dilemma. Here's some evidence about Sellars saying that he doesn't want to get rid of universals completely, because I seem to, unless I'm misremembering, I think sometimes maybe one reads commentators upon Sellars interpreting him as wanting to just really throw universals out the window, but I don't think he wants to do that. And here he's saying, this is from Empiricism and Abstract Entities, he says, he says, there is nothing in such sentences as, in German, rot means a quality, in German, rot means a universal, in German, rot means something and does not mean a particular. There's nothing in those sentences which should disturb the scientific and empiricist sensibilities of the most tough-minded philosopher. So, okay, he's saying he doesn't want to get rid of universals, okay, he wants to reconceptualize universals in a radical way. All right, so coming back to this, writing Socrates in bold, that's something that someone does. You write it in bold, you decide to do that. Writing it in italics, that's something someone does. At the same time, for Sellars, you can't actually grasp the difference between a bold-faced word and a word in italics without having some separate predicates. You still need separate predicates, because you need to understand that a bold-faced word is a word that's written in with thick lines. Thick is a predicate. Italics is written in a kind of leaning way. Leaning is a separate predicate again. You can't get rid of the separate predicates, I don't think. And so that's the dilemma. And here's a quote from Language and Meaning by Sellars. He says, I have often been asked, what does one gain by abandoning such standard Platonic entities as triangularity, or that 2 plus 2 equals 4, only to countenance such exotic abstract entities as functions, roles, rules, and pieces? The answer is, of course, that the above strategy abandons nothing but a picture. And I think he means picture in a kind of pejorative way, like a kind of naive way of thinking about something. Triangularity is not abandoned. Rather, triangularity is seen for what it is, a metalinguistic distributive singular term. And once the general point has been made that abstract singular terms are metalinguistic distributive singular terms, that's what they are, rather than labels of irreducible eternal objects, there is no reason why one should not use abstract singular terms and categories of abstract singular terms in explicating specific problems about language and meaning. For just as talk about triangularity can be unfolded into talk about triangular inscriptions, so talk about any abstract entity can be unfolded into talk about linguistic or conceptual tokens. Okay, so we've got this new term introduced here, metalinguistic distributive singular term, which I underlined, the first one. And this is where I want to try to locate the particularities of Sellars' response to the problem of universals. And we need to work out what is a distributive singular term. So it's not a given object that you could passively intuit. It's not there before it's constructed through some kind of practice. Sellars even calls this an odd object. And I think an appropriate metaphor to sort of grasp what Sellars wants to say is this metaphor about kind of a river depositing silt upon its riverbanks and forming the shapes of the riverbanks. So the way the riverbanks are shaped is something that gets created by the movement of the river, except here we're not talking about the ebbs and flows and eddies of the river. We're talking about something that's done by humans. And furthermore, Sellars is going to emphasize that the shapes of the riverbank may shift, transform in a kind of like sudden and discontinuous way, which actually perhaps riverbanks can do that. So can we run over, or it's because we're getting a bit late?
No, it's okay.
Yeah?
We'll start late. So.
Okay. All right, I think so. I should now, because now we're talking about theory change again, I should read this thing about this set of aphorisms, which is about theory change in some sense. So you've got, in the 18th century, first half of the 18th century, you have Montesquieu, the political philosopher, who writes, he says, the best is the mortal enemy of the good. And this becomes a kind of a sort of proverb trotted out, I think, with some frequency by some people. And this is about, so the best is the enemy of the good. Don't be too ambitious. Don't aim for the best. Just settle for a kind of tinkering improvement of what you've managed to achieve so far. Just try and improve stuff a little bit. That's how I think that proverb works. And then Hegel, in the philosophy of right, rejects that proverb. He reverses it. He says, the greatest enemy of the good is the better. So no, don't become obsessed with this kind of tinkering, trying to make small, reformist, incremental improvements on something. If so, you'll never actually get to the point where you set it into effectivity or actually use it to do anything. And then Sellars gives that another twist. Sellars says the better is the enemy of the best. So the best comes back. So how are we to interpret Sellars' quip, the better is the enemy of the best? So I think what he's saying is he's expressing his view that actually Sellars is actually never going to be satisfied, it seems to me, with any theory. He's never going to want to halt with it, because he's always going to want to negate it with another theory that might be round the corner. Very, very briefly, that's a difference with Brandom, for whom Brandam's modal realism implies that when you've achieved a piece of knowledge, like regarding the melting point of copper, Brandam thinks that piece of knowledge has always, eternally been thus before people discovered it and will always be so. But Sellars does not think that. He continues to hold a kind of this irrealist nominalism, whereby if you've replaced a chair with electrons and protons, he's not saying that you should necessarily, he's not saying you should think that electrons and protons are completely real, because for Sellars, that future science may negate and refute that with a different theory. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say about that. Okay, so Okay, so very simply, again, our knowledge of what it is that we're doing for sellers is mediated by these distributive singular terms that he replaced universals with. And that's one of the reasons why there's an opacity of our practice to itself. We can be wrong about what it is that we're doing. As Sellarsian says here, I would be the last person to say that the meaning of a term is its use, for there is no sense of use which analyzes the relevant sense of means. And if there's no sense of use which analyzes the relevant sense of means, I think this is in part because we need to construct theories about what it is that we're doing before we can understand it. And so this is just a very, very simple point, that Marx's critique of political economy is precisely this type of theory, because we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know what it was we didn't know that we were exchanging commodities necessarily. We didn't know what they were until Marx conceptualized them. Okay, I've prepared too much stuff, so I think I'll try and get to the end of it just kind of quickly, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to skip that. All right, yeah, I'll try and get to the end of my presentation by just doing one more quick thought experiment and then saying something about Hegel and then concluding. So if we go back to Socrates, right, when you're playing the game of jumblies, there are, as I was hinting before, there are rules, there are norms and oughts in play for you to play this game. So, you know, there's an ought. If we've agreed that boldface will characterize a term as being wise, then when you see that it's boldface, you ought to conclude that the term is being characterized as wise. That's an ought. So you can't play that game without oughts. He's not using this type of thought experiment to try and seal up the gap between the is and the ought. That's not what it's about, I don't think. Hegel, on the other hand, is criticized by Marx precisely for sealing up this gap between the is and the ought. So in the philosophy of right, we've got this image of the rose in the cross of the present, which we can't see the quote, but he says something like to recognize the rose in the cross of the present as reason is something, it implies reconciliation with actuality and is to be celebrated. So the cross is an instrument of execution, torturous execution. It represents everything that is derisory, lamentable about the present, but there's, in the image, there's a rose in the cross. The rose represents the ingredients or resources in present actuality, which can be mobilized to negate and overcome what is lamentable about the present. But the thing is, Hegel views the surpassing of present theoretical and social contradictions as something that the concept, ideality itself, can effectuate and can achieve for itself. This is something that Marx, again, brutally simply, this is something that Marx rejects. Contradictions in theory, social contradictions, the resources allowing for them to be resolved, overcome, may not make themselves intelligible without a transformation in social practice first. And I found this curious quote in Hegel's essay, Who Thinks Abstractly, wherein, in a way, this is a detour, but I think it's maybe worth it even though we're running late, because it's kind of instructively weird and bizarre, I think. Hegel seems to be prevaricating, hesitating as regards his rose in the cross of the present image. It's a bit macabre, but I'm going to read it. He's kind of got some doubts springing from an example of what people do at executions in Leipzig. So he says, it is quite different in refined sentimental circles in Leipzig. There they strewed and bound flowers on the wheel, and on the criminal who was tied to it. The wheel is another instrument of execution. But this again is the opposite abstraction. The Christians may indeed trifle with Rosicrucianism, or rather cross-rosism, and wreathe roses around the cross. The cross is the gallows and wheel that have long been hallowed. It has lost its one-sided significance of being the instrument of dishonorable punishment, and on the contrary, suggests the notion of the highest pain and the deepest rejection, together with the most joyous rapture and divine honor. The wheel in Leipzig, on the other hand, wreathed with violets and poppies, is a reconciliation a la Kotzebue, that's an author that Hegel doesn't like, who he's slugging off, a kind of slovenly sociability between sentimentality and badness. So I just wanted to flag that because it's kind of seemed like an interesting thing to stumble across. He seems to be kind of, Hegel here is worried about his own sort of absolute idealism, I think. He's sort of anticipating Marx, perhaps, here. Okay, so I need to conclude, which I will do now. And okay, so to get back to dot quotes, when one first looks at Sellarsian's use of dot quotes, seems to be a temptation to maybe interpret what he's doing with them as being maybe he wants to do a kind of physicalist reduction here. So maybe he's wanting to reduce the use of a word to just sort of neurophysiologically what someone is doing when they're saying the word. So that's very much not what I think he's doing with this type of, when he's deploying dot quotes in this way in his theory regarding theory change. It's not, you're not forming this kind of like dry and brittle token that's just stuck on a functional role like a label. It's not a reductive kind of functionalist freezing, I don't think, because naming a functional role when explanatorily ramified, as opposed to being a mere act of labeling, creates a meaning and a content, or it ratifies an explanation. So when you're setting up this, when you decide to affirm a reclassification of a term as another term using dot quotes, he's not denying that you do this because you've got a bunch of reasons, you might have explanations, you have a theory, you might have a wager, you might already have corroborations of your theory, which you may have constructed through analogical reasoning. So he's not denying that you've got this kind of, let's say, this sort of lubrication of subjectivity and subjective decision, allowing you to make this creative move. That's my conclusion about dot quoting. And it seems that for Sellars, ultimately the ratification of whether that was a good move will end up being about what it allows you to do. Does it allow you, in fact, to end up creating something qualitatively new, I think that's what Sellars thinks, because it's not clear what else could be the ratification of this type of move as ultimately truthful or good. So finally, just to bring this back in, again, a very simplistic way to some of the things that Iad was talking about, we can ask regarding what Sonrettel calls real abstractions, which are things like value, exchange value, or abstract labor. If these don't pre-exist our activity, does that mean that we're constantly recreating them every day against our own will? Because if not, then they would seem to have drifted free from subjective activity. It seems to be something that you have to do. There has to be an act. Every time a commodity is exchanged, it seems, if we follow Sellars, that has to be a reproduction of the exchange value abstraction. Because if not, it would float off in what Iad, as I understood him, was referring to as objectivism. It would be separated from subjectivity. And then simply, it seems that it will be necessary to think about these real abstractions, not in this kind of dry and brittle objectivist way, but to determine how it is that they continue to retain this like lubrication of subjectivity. And I'll stop there. I'm sorry for how messy that was.
Any questions? No? Okay. There's one from Matthew. I think Matthew, who's online, is the first. Can you unmute yourself, Matthew?
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that talk. I was just thinking about the role that dot quotation is playing on this reading of Sellars. And I wonder if, thinking about Sellars' sort of political views, whether he really would have been so sort of, whether you can read such a sort of, debunking progressive role for dot quotation into him, right? So, I really like this as a reading of dot quotation as something that's useful for people on the left, right? But isn't there a reading of Sellars which says, hey, I'm a fairly conservative guy. I'm just thinking about dot quotation as an analysis of meaning in a nominalistic fashion, right? I just want to get rid of these sort of abstract objects, and I just want to use this as a sort of way of talking about predicates without having to refer to abstract objects. And that's all I want from dot quotation.
Well, I'm not sure, because Sellars has got a theory of truth which he's very serious about, especially in the book Science and Metaphysics, and it seems that's the first point. Truth, taken seriously, is in some way consequentially about what's real. Okay, that's an obvious point. Secondly, in Sellars, you've got this quite strong streak of sort of anti-voluntarism, whereby I think you do have a thematization of this question of, if we get rid of, if we want to get rid of predicates, that's all well and good, but then what do you do next? Because the predicates that you've got they have serious consequences about what you can do, and not only that, in some sense, they force you to do things, actually, because your options about what you can do are sort of finite, and basically all the time they're imposed upon you, and you're stuck with them, and you have to struggle with that limited set of options. You're not in this kind of you're not in a big supermarket filled with any predicate you could want to sort of magic up. And I really think that that's a strong strand in Sellars. So the predicates that we've got, such as they are in their facticity, they're linked to what we're being actually kind of forced to do every day. So perhaps one could separate off the metalinguistic theory regarding meaning from this anti-voluntaristic strand. Maybe, but then I guess we'd have to look at the details of how one would argue for that if one wants to do it in a Sellarsian way. So that's an attempt to respond on that question, which I don't know if it's satisfying.
Okay. It seems
Cheers.
it is. I think we have a couple from the audience before turning back to Liad. I think you. Who else?
Thank you for the talk. Sorry, you just on one of your slides when you were discussing the Hegel quote, and this isn't very relevant to the main meat of your talk, but you said that that in this quote Hegel kind of undermines his own absolute idealism. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I was using. I was referring to. Let's say, okay, if we say that things are not the way they ought to be, we're saying there's some sort. We can sort of express that by saying there's some kind of gap between the is and the ought. So things are a certain way, which we don't like, which is bad. They ought to be another way. And then how are we going to work out, how are we going to sort of reason our way towards a strategy for overcoming what's bad about the way things are? Because that tends to be a sort of difficult challenge. But the thing is, as I understand Hegel, it's reason itself as a kind of absolutely self-relating, self-elaborating, infinite process of kind of creation, which can it seems to be guaranteed to work out how to seal up the gap between the is and the ought, how to resolve the contradictions and the kind of tragic aspects of reality. But then I found this, and that's you've got a rose in the cross of the present. You've got what you need, even at the heart of the worst kind of nadir. You've got the resources because they're just already there in the infinite self-relation of the concept. So that's my understanding of it. But then I really thought this quote was really curious, where he's saying. I'm reading a lot into it and extrapolating a lot, but he's kind of, in Leipzig, people are like strewing some, what was it, like violets onto the cross during an execution, which is true does seem kind of, there's something hideous or grotesque, I suppose, maybe. I mean, I don't know much about execution practices at that time, but it's just really, it struck me that Hegel would get kind of hung up on that, and he would say, no, this is why they're doing that, because he's saying that's sort of disgusting. But isn't his own articulation of what the rose and the cross of the present means kind of, from a Marxian perspective, it is lacking, it is complacent. So Marx would maybe be saying, Hegel wants to say kind of like the rose, it's almost like the wood of the cross is a soil out of which the rose of the future kind of directly sprouts. But Marx is saying, no, there's no guarantee that this rose sprouts. And furthermore, it's, you might not be able to work out a fully elaborated strategy without a social revolution which happens in practice before you can understand in theory what needs to be done.
Okay, are you satisfied with the, okay. Yeah. Liad, can you unmute yourself?
Yes,
Okay.
thanks. So this question kind of is also about the double dot quotations, and kind of just to better understand and trying to relate this to Marx. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't get myself into the dot stuff in Capital is it's a bit complicated, because in Capital there seems to be, like how in the phenomenology there are two positions of consciousness and phenomenologists. In Capital there are also two positions, in the sense that Marx is critiquing the state of affair. So if you want, and not to forget that agency is involved, a critique of everyday consciousness, but at once it's a critique of political economy, of the understanding of this state of affair. And so, like, the dot quotation, like, it seems like if one understands the equivalence with money, what it provides is what it is useful for is against money fetishism, where you understand that you are functionally equivocating a certain commodity with money. So there is no value per se inherent in gold or whatever. That seems to be the analog as far as I understand. But then there's this other moment of critique of political economy. And I was wondering if this lines up with your own thinking, if the dot quotations, the double dot quotation is where it's involved. Because I mean, the political economists, as Marx says, they don't fall for the money fetish. They are already looking behind prices, and this is how they have theories of value. But Marx is dissatisfied with this theory. So I wonder. So my question maybe is just: I wonder if this is where you're finding, if you are finding this kind of role of the double dot quotation. This is where you would locate it.
I suppose I think yes, why not? Because so if you take David Ricardo, for example, you've got there a kind of, as I understand it, a sort of substantialist theory, a sort of substantialist labor theory of value, whereby it's a quantity of labor. I'm slightly vague on how Ricardo wants to measure it, whether it be by time or by, in a more naive way, regarding the kind of like sweat and effort. I think it's probably by time. But anyway, you have a quantity of labor which the worker expends on producing a commodity, and that quantity more or less directly determines the pricing, I think, from what I understand of Ricardo. So yes, I think maybe the double dot quoting device is helpful here, because don't we have quite a radical break between Ricardo and Marx regarding what value is? It's really not what Ricardo said it, labor, we're talking about the relation between concrete labor time, are supposed to be more precise, and value as it plays into pricing. But I think, yes, things seem to be radically different in Marx. I think you do have a disidentification and then a more or less radical reclassification, because he's introducing the extraction of surplus value, which has as its sort of motor or engine the self-valorization of value. And those things are really not, to my knowledge, there in Ricardo. So yeah, I mean, that's quite a radical break. You're not really talking about this almost kind of palpable sort of like blob or quantity of labor anymore. You've had a whole shift in the surrounding context of presuppositions, I think. So yeah, I think so, yeah.